Hey everyone, welcome back. Really, thank you for all the support. If you're into stories that make sleep feel optional, consider subscribing and sharing the channel with someone who enjoys a good scare too. It helps more than you can imagine. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let these unsettling tales do the rest. I inherited my grandfather's cabin in eastern Tennessee when I was 28. I'd only been there once as a kid, maybe 15 years before, and I barely remembered it. My mom said Grandpa Joe had built it himself back in the 70s, deep in the woods near the Cherokee National Forest. When the lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited the property, I figured I'd drive up, take a look, and probably sell it. The drive took longer than I expected. The main highway petered out into state roads, then county roads, then finally a dirt track that wound through thick forest for another 3 miles. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the ridgeline. The place looked rough. The wood siding had weathered to a dull gray, and moss grew thick on the north-facing side. But it was bigger than I remembered. 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that looked sturdy enough. The windows were intact, which surprised me. I'd expected broken glass and raccoon nests. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed inside. The door was unlocked. Grandpa Joe never believed in locks this far out. The interior smelled like old wood and dust, but it was dry. The main room had a fireplace, a couch covered in a stained sheet, and a small kitchenette along the back wall. There was a narrow staircase leading up to what I assumed was a bedroom. What struck me immediately was the number of doors. There were 5 of them on the first floor alone. One led outside to the porch. That made sense. Another opened to a small bathroom with a rusted sink and a chemical toilet. But the other 3 were strange. 2 of them were on the same wall, side by side, which seemed wasteful. And the 5th was tucked in the corner near the fireplace, almost hidden. I opened the first side-by-side door. It was a closet, mostly empty except for some old coats and a broken lantern. The second door, right next to it, opened to another closet, nearly identical, just as empty. It seemed like a bizarre design choice. The 5th door, the one by the fireplace, didn't want to open at first. The handle turned, but the door was swollen in the frame. I had to put my shoulder into it before it gave way with a groan. Inside was a narrow storage space, more like a crawl space. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with canning jars, old tools, and boxes of nails. At the back, I noticed another door. That threw me. A door inside a closet? I squeezed past the shelves and tried the handle. It was locked. I jiggled it a few times, but it wouldn't budge. There was no keyhole, just a simple latch that seemed rusted shut. I figured it was probably just access to the crawl space under the house. Still, something about it felt off. I spent the rest of the evening sweeping out the main room and getting the fireplace going. By the time I finished, it was full dark outside. The forest was loud. Crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. I heated up a can of chili on the propane stove and ate it while sitting on the porch, watching the shadows shift between the trees. Around 10, I went upstairs to check out the bedroom. It was a single room with a slanted ceiling and a metal frame bed. The mattress looked ancient, but I threw my sleeping bag on top of it and figured it'd do for the night. That's when I noticed another door. It was built into the wall at the far end of the room, almost flush with the paneling. If it hadn't been for the handle, I might have missed it entirely. I walked over and opened it, expecting maybe an attic access or another closet. Instead, I found a second bedroom. It was nearly identical to the one I was standing in. Same slanted ceiling, same metal frame bed, even the same faded wallpaper. But this room had no windows, just walls, a bed, and another door on the opposite side. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of the layout. Why would you build two identical bedrooms back to back? And why would the second one have no windows? I crossed the room and opened the far door, half expecting to find my way back to the first bedroom. Instead, I found a third. This one was different, smaller. The walls were bare wood, unfinished, and the floor was just plywood. There was no bed, no furniture, just an empty space, and another door. My chest tightened. Something about this felt wrong. I backed out, closed the door, and returned to the first bedroom. I told myself it was just weird construction. Maybe Grandpa Joe had planned to expand and never finished. But the way the rooms connected, it didn't make sense. The cabin wasn't big enough to hold that many rooms. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the layout was wrong. Around midnight, I got up and walked back through the doors, counting as I went. First bedroom, second bedroom, third room. Then I opened the fourth door. It led back to the first bedroom. That was impossible. I'd walked in a straight line. There was no way the rooms could loop like that unless the house bent in on itself. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, and tried to logic it out. Maybe I'd gotten turned around. Maybe the doors were angled in a way that I didn't notice. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I went back downstairs, poured myself a glass of water, and sat by the fireplace. The embers were still glowing, casting faint light across the room. I stared at the fifth door, the one by the corner, the one that led to the storage space with the locked door at the back. I don't know why, but I got up and opened it again. The storage space was the same. Shelves, jars, tools. But the door at the back was open now. I hadn't unlocked it. I was sure of that. I stood at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond. There were stairs leading down, rough-cut and steep, disappearing into blackness. Every instinct told me not to go down there, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and descended. The stairs went deeper than they should have. I counted 20 steps, then 30, then 40. The air grew colder, and I could hear water dripping somewhere below. At the bottom, I found another door. This one was newer than the others, clean wood, modern hinges. I opened it and stepped through. I was in the main room of the cabin. I spun around, disoriented. The fireplace was behind me, the couch to my left. I was standing exactly where I'd been 10 minutes ago. But I'd just walked down 40 steps. I bolted for the front door and yanked it open, stepping out onto the porch. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and sharp. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were 6 doors on the porch. When I'd arrived, there had been one. The front door. Now there were 6, evenly spaced along the wraparound, each one identical. I walked over to the nearest one and opened it. Inside was the main room. I closed it and opened the next door. Same room, third door, same. I opened all 6. Every single one led to the same place. I don't remember making the decision to leave. I just remember running to my truck, throwing it in reverse, and tearing down that dirt road as fast as the vehicle would go. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I got home, I called a real estate agent and told them to sell the property as is. I didn't care what it went for. I just wanted it gone. The agent called me back 2 weeks later, confused. She said she'd driven out to the address I gave her, but there was nothing there. No cabin, no clearing, just forest. She'd checked the county records, and according to them, my grandfather had never owned land in that area. I still have the deed. I've looked at it a dozen times. The address is right there in black and white. But when I plug it into a map, it doesn't exist. Last month, I was cleaning out my closet and found an old photo album that had belonged to my grandfather. I flipped through it, looking at pictures of him when he was younger. Fishing trips, family gatherings, the usual stuff. Near the back, I found a photo of the cabin. It was dated 1974, the year he supposedly built it. In the picture, he's standing on the porch, smiling. Behind him, I can see the front of the cabin clearly. There are 9 doors. My wife Sarah and I bought a cabin in the mountains outside Asheville in 2019. It was one of those impulse decisions you make when you're tired of city life and convinced that owning a second property will somehow fix everything. The place was small but charming. 2 bedrooms, a loft, and a deck that overlooked a valley thick with pines and maples. We used it maybe 6 times that first year. The rest of the time we listed it on a vacation rental site to offset the mortgage. The income was decent and most of the guests were easy. Couples looking for a quiet weekend, families wanting to hike. We had a property manager, Linda, who handled the keys and cleaning. We barely had to think about it. Everything was fine until March of 2020. That's when the Turners booked a month-long stay. I remember feeling relieved when the reservation came through. COVID had just started shutting things down, and bookings were getting canceled left and right. A full month of guaranteed income felt like a lifeline. Linda met them at the cabin on a Sunday afternoon. She texted me afterward. Nice couple. Quiet. Paid cash for the whole month up front. That last part surprised me. Most people paid through the app, but I figured they were older and preferred doing things the old-fashioned way. Linda said they seemed polite, maybe in their 50s, and didn't ask many questions. The husband's name was David. The wife was Anna. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Then Linda called me on a Thursday evening, and I could tell something was off by her tone. "Have you heard from the Turners?" she asked. "No." "Why?" She hesitated. "I drove by the cabin today to drop off some firewood and I don't know. Something felt weird." "Weird how?" "All the mirrors were covered. Every single one. Sheets, towels, even taped newspaper over the bathroom mirror. And the smell. What kind of smell? Sage. Really strong, like they'd been burning it constantly. But there was something else underneath it. Something rotten. I told her it was probably nothing. Maybe they were just doing some kind of spiritual cleanse or meditation thing. But she didn't sound convinced. 2 days later, she called again. "I went back this morning," she said. "The deck furniture was gone." "What do you mean gone?" "The table, the chairs, everything." I looked around the property and found them. They dragged everything into the woods and arranged it in a circle. And in the center, they built this structure. What kind of structure? Sticks, branches, woven together like a teepee, but wrong. The proportions were off, and there were things hanging from it. What things? I couldn't tell. They looked like bags, fabric pouches tied with string. I didn't get close enough to see what was inside. I didn't know what to make of it. Technically, they'd rented the property, and unless they were damaging something, I wasn't sure I could tell them to stop. I told Linda to document everything with photos, but not to confront them. That night, Sarah and I looked at Linda's photos. The structure was bizarre, about 8 feet tall, made from branches that had been stripped of bark and lashed together with what looked like dried grass. The pouches hanging from it were stained dark, and in one photo, you could see something wet dripping from the bottom of one. "That's blood," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe it's just from an animal. They could be hunters." In March. And why build that thing? I didn't have an answer. The next day, Linda called me in a panic. They're painting the cabin, she said. Painting it? We didn't authorize that. Not the outside, the inside. I looked through the window. Every wall is covered in red symbols. Circles, spirals, things I don't recognize. And they're using their hands, no brushes, just dipping their fingers in paint and... Her voice cracked. It's not paint. What? I saw the buckets. It's not paint, it's too thick, too dark. I think it's blood. I told her I was driving up immediately. She said she'd wait for me in town. The drive took 2 hours. When I arrived at the cabin, their car was still in the driveway, a dark blue sedan with mud caked on the wheel wells. The curtains were drawn, but I could see flickering light through the gaps, like candles. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Mr. Turner, it's the owner. I need to speak with you. The door opened. David Turner stood there, and I barely recognized him from Linda's description. He'd lost weight. A lot of it. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. His clothes were stained, and his hands were covered in dried red-brown smears. "We're not finished," he said. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been screaming. "Finished with what?" "The ceiling. It has to be complete before the new moon. Mr. Turner, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is... You don't understand." He leaned closer, and I caught the smell. Rot and copper and something else. Something chemical that burned my nostrils. "It's already inside. We're trying to keep it in. If we leave now, it'll spread." "What's inside?" He stared at me for a long moment. Then he stepped back and closed the door. I called the police. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. I explained the situation, the unauthorized modifications, Linda's concerns, the strange behavior. They agreed to do a wellness check. The officers knocked. No answer. They announced themselves, waited, then tried the door. It was unlocked. I watched from the driveway as they went inside. They were in there for maybe 5 minutes before one of them came back out, pale and shaking. "You need to call the fire department," he said, "and probably the health department." "What's in there?" "Ma'am, I need you to stay back." But I could see through the open door. The walls were covered in symbols, just like Linda had said. But they weren't painted with blood. They were carved into the drywall, deep gouges that exposed the studs beneath. And the furniture. Everything had been piled in the center of the living room and covered with what looked like animal carcasses. Deer, raccoons, possums, all in various states of decay. The Turners weren't inside. The officers searched the entire property. Their car was there, their belongings were there, but David and Anna were gone. The fire department came and cleared out the debris. They found 23 dead animals, all killed within the past few weeks. The symbols carved into the walls showed patterns. They started small near the doors and windows, then grew larger and more elaborate toward the center of the house. A local anthropologist we contacted said the symbols were a mix of Appalachian folk magic and something else, something he didn't recognize. Binding marks, he called them, meant to trap something. We tore the cabin down 6 months later. It cost more to repair than it was worth. And honestly, neither of us could stand the thought of anyone staying there again. We never found out what happened to the Turners. The police investigated, but found no trace of them. Their car was registered to a false name. The credit card they'd used was stolen. It was like they'd never existed. But last week, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph of our property, taken from the woods. It showed the empty lot where the cabin used to be. And written on the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, "You shouldn't have torn it down. Now there's nothing keeping it in." 3 days later, our neighbor called. He'd found something in his yard. a structure made of branches, woven together, with fabric pouches hanging from the top. It was exactly like the one Linda had described. I took a job as a winter caretaker in the mountains of West Virginia the year I turned 30. I'd just gone through a bad divorce and needed to get away from everything. The apartment we'd shared, the friends who didn't know whose side to take, the city that felt like it was closing in on me. When I saw the posting online for a live-in caretaker position at a remote cabin, it felt like exactly what I needed. The job was simple. Stay at the property from November through March, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, keep the driveway clear of snow, and do basic maintenance. The owner, a guy named Mr. Brennan, lived in Florida and only used the place in summer. He'd had problems with squatters and vandals in previous winters, so he wanted someone on site. The pay wasn't great, but it included free housing and utilities. I'd have plenty of time to myself. I met Brennan once, briefly, when he drove up to show me the property in late October. He was in his 70s, soft-spoken, with the kind of face that looked like it had spent a lot of time outdoors. The cabin was bigger than I expected. 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a stone fireplace that dominated the main room. It sat on about 20 acres of forested land, with the nearest neighbor more than 2 miles away. "It gets quiet up here," Mr. Brennan said as he showed me around. "Real quiet. You okay with that?" I told him I was. Quiet sounded perfect. Before he left, he gave me one piece of advice that stuck with me. "The old well out back," he said, pointing to a stone structure about 30 yards from the cabin. "It's been capped for years, but sometimes the cover shifts. Don't go messing with it. We had a caretaker years ago who tried to open it, said he heard something down there. Damned fool nearly fell in." I asked what happened to him. He left after 2 weeks. Said the place didn't agree with him. Mr. Brennan drove away that afternoon, and I was alone. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. I spent my days chopping wood, reading, and taking long walks through the property. The forest was beautiful in late autumn, all reds and golds, with a carpet of leaves that crunched under my boots. At night, I'd sit by the fire with a book or listen to music. The isolation felt like a balm. The first snow came in mid-November. It was light, just a few inches, but it transformed everything. The woods went silent in a way I'd never experienced before. Not just quiet, but muffled, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. That's when I started noticing the well. I don't know why it drew my attention. It was just a circular stone structure, maybe 4 feet across, with a wooden cover held down by a heavy rock. But every time I walked past it, I felt compelled to stop and look. One morning, I noticed the cover had shifted. Not much, maybe an inch, just enough to create a dark gap along one edge. I remembered what Mr. Brennan had said and left it alone. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What had the previous caretaker heard down there? The next day, the gap was wider. The rock was still in place, but the cover had definitely moved. I told myself it was just the freeze-thaw cycle, the wood expanding and contracting. But when I checked the next morning, the cover had shifted again. Now there was a gap almost 6 inches wide, and I could hear something. It was faint, barely audible, a sound like wind moving through a tunnel. But there was no wind that day. The air was perfectly still. I walked closer and knelt beside the well. The sound was coming from below, a low, steady whisper that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm. I leaned over and shone my flashlight into the gap. The beam disappeared into darkness. The well was deep. Deeper than it should have been for a residential property. I couldn't see the bottom. The whispering stopped. I backed away slowly and went inside. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had noticed me looking. That night, I woke to a sound outside my window. Scraping, like something being dragged across gravel. I got up and looked out. In the moonlight, I could see the well. The cover was completely off now, lying on the ground beside it. The opening was exposed, a perfect black circle in the snow. I watched for several minutes. Nothing moved, but I could see my breath fogging the window, and beyond it, rising from the well, was a thin column of mist. It wasn't cold enough for that. The temperature had been above freezing all day. I sat by the window until dawn, watching. The mist continued to rise, growing thicker, spreading across the ground like a living thing. By first light, it had reached halfway to the cabin. When the sun came up, the mist evaporated. I went outside and found the wooden cover lying 20 feet from the well, like it had been thrown. I called Mr. Brennan. He didn't pick up, so I left a voicemail. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I'm not sure I succeeded. That evening, I noticed something had changed inside the cabin. Small things at first, a chair that wasn't where I'd left it. A book moved from one table to another. I told myself I was forgetting where I'd put things. But then I found the photographs. They were scattered across the kitchen table. Old black and white photos, maybe from the 60s or 70s. They showed the cabin, the property, and in several of them, the well, before it had been capped. In one photo, a man stood beside it, smiling. He looked like he was in his 40s, wearing work clothes and holding a shovel. I didn't recognize him, and I had no idea where the photos had come from. I'd never seen them before, and I'd been through every drawer and closet in the cabin. I gathered them up and put them in a drawer, trying to ignore the unease spreading through my chest. That night, I heard footsteps in the attic. The cabin didn't have an attic. It was a single-story structure with a vaulted ceiling. There was no space above me, but I could hear them clearly. Slow, deliberate footsteps, walking from one end of the ceiling to the other. They stopped directly above my bed, and I heard 3 distinct knocks. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, listening as the footsteps resumed, pacing back and forth, until the sun came up. The next morning, I went outside to look at the roof. I thought maybe an animal had gotten up there, or a branch was scraping against the shingles, but what I found made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the snow on the roof. Bare footprints, human-shaped but wrong. The toes too long, the stride too wide, and they were facing backward. They led from the well to the cabin, then up the side of the building, across the roof, and back down the other side. The trail ended at my bedroom window. I packed my things that afternoon. I'd had enough. I called Mr. Brennan again. Still no answer. I left another message, this time telling him I was leaving, and why. But when I tried to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, which made no sense. It was new, and I'd driven into town just 2 days before. I was stranded. That night was the worst. The footsteps came earlier, louder. They weren't just in the attic anymore. They were inside the walls, in the crawl space beneath the floor, circling the cabin from every direction. And then I heard my name. It came from the well, clear as day. My voice, calling myself. "Come here," it said. "Come see." I huddled in the corner of the living room. My phone clutched in my hand, but there was no signal. There never had been. The voice continued through the night, repeating my name, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always in my own voice. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I was hiking out. It was 12 miles to the nearest town, but I'd rather risk that than spend another night in that cabin. I made it about half a mile before I found the trail blocked. Trees had fallen across it. Fresh cuts, not natural falls. Someone had chopped them down deliberately. I tried going around, pushing through the underbrush, but everywhere I turned I found more obstacles. The forest was a maze of downed trees and thick brambles. After 3 hours, I stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted and defeated. The well cover was back in place. The rock sat on top, exactly as it had been when I first arrived. I approached slowly and knelt beside it. Scratched into the wood in letters that looked burned in was a single word: stay. I spent 3 more days in that cabin. The footsteps continued every night, but I stopped caring. I stopped eating. I barely slept. I just sat by the fire and waited. On the 4th day, a truck pulled up. It was Mr. Brennan. He said he'd gotten worried when I hadn't answered his calls. I told him I hadn't gotten any calls. My phone showed no missed calls, no voicemails except the ones I'd left for him. He drove me into town. I didn't tell him about the well, the footsteps, or the voice. I just said I needed to leave. He paid me for my time and didn't ask questions. 6 months later, I heard that Mr. Brennan had sold the property. The new owner was planning to renovate, turn it into a year-round rental. They found something when they were excavating for a new foundation. The well went down more than 200 feet, far deeper than any residential well should go, and at the bottom, they found remains. Human remains. 3 different people based on what the coroner could determine. They'd been down there for decades. They never identified them. I think about that place sometimes. About the voice that used my name. About the footsteps that walked where there was no space to walk. And I wonder who those people were, and if they're still down there. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly editorial work, travel magazines, lifestyle pieces, the occasional corporate gig. In the fall of 2021, I got hired by a regional outdoors magazine to shoot a series on abandoned cabins in the Appalachians. The idea was to capture the slow reclamation of these old structures by nature. Vines crawling through windows, roofs caving in, that sort of thing. The magazine gave me a list of locations across Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Most were easy to find, right off hiking trails or old logging roads. But one place on the list stood out, a cabin deep in the mountains near the Virginia-Kentucky border, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The editor, Marcus, sent me the coordinates along with a note. This one's supposed to be really photogenic. Built in the 1800s, completely untouched. No road access, you'll have to hike in about 3 miles. Worth it for the shots, though. I drove out on a Wednesday in late October. The leaves were at peak color, and the light was perfect, soft and golden, the kind photographers wait all year for. I parked at a trailhead and started the hike in, carrying my camera bag and a small backpack with water and snacks. The trail was barely maintained, overgrown in places, but the coordinates were accurate. After about 2.5 hours, I found it. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. It was bigger than I expected. 2 stories, with a stone foundation and a chimney still mostly intact. The wood siding had weathered to a silver gray, and the windows were dark and empty. Vines had claimed most of the front wall, and the porch sagged dangerously on one side. It was perfect. I spent the first hour circling the property, taking exterior shots from different angles. The light coming through the trees created these beautiful shafts of gold that cut through the shadows. I got some great compositions. The cabin framed by fall foliage, close-ups of the texture on the old wood, the way the vines wound through the broken windows. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to go inside. The front door was missing, just an empty frame. I stepped through carefully, testing the floorboards before putting my full weight on them. The interior was mostly bare. A few pieces of broken furniture, a rusted stove in the corner, debris scattered across the floor. Dust hung thick in the air, visible in the light streaming through the gaps in the walls. I started shooting. The decay was beautiful in its own way. Peeling wallpaper, collapsed ceiling beams, the way nature was slowly erasing all evidence of human habitation. I was framing a shot of the staircase when I noticed something odd. On the wall at the top of the stairs, there was a dark stain. It looked like water damage at first, but the shape was too uniform. Roughly circular, maybe 3 feet across. And in the center of it, there was a symbol scratched into the wood. It looked like a circle with lines radiating out from it, almost like a child's drawing of the sun. I climbed the stairs carefully. Half the steps were rotten, and the railing was gone. When I reached the top, I got a closer look at the symbol. It wasn't scratched into the wood. It was burned in, the edges charred and black. I took a few photos, then moved down the hallway. There were 2 rooms on the second floor, both empty except for debris. But in the second room, I found more symbols. They were everywhere, burned into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Dozens of them, all the same design, circles with radiating lines. Some were small, no bigger than my hand. Others were massive, covering entire walls. The air in that room felt wrong, heavier somehow, colder than it should have been. I took my shots quickly and backed out. Something about that room made my skin crawl. I was about to head back downstairs when I noticed a third door at the end of the hallway. It was closed, which seemed strange. Every other door in the cabin had either rotted away or been left open. I walked over and tried the handle. It turned easily. Inside was a small room, maybe 8 by 10 feet. Unlike the rest of the cabin, this room wasn't empty. There was a chair in the center. Wooden, simple, facing the far wall. And on the wall, someone had painted something. It was a mural, faded and cracked with age, but still visible. It showed a forest scene, but wrong. The trees were bent and twisted, their branches reaching down like hands. And in the center, there was a figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with arms that hung down past its knees. Where its face should have been, there was just darkness. A void, empty and absolute. I stared at it for a long moment, my camera forgotten. There was something deeply unsettling about the proportions, the way the figure seemed to dominate the landscape around it despite being just a painting. I raised my camera and took a shot. The flash went off, and for just a second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows at the edge of the room. I spun around. Nothing there, just the empty doorway. I took a breath, steadying myself. I was being ridiculous. It was just an old cabin, just a creepy painting. I'd seen weirder things on these shoots. I took a few more photos of the mural, then headed back downstairs. The light was starting to fade, and I wanted to get back to the trailhead before dark. I made it about halfway down the mountain before I realized I'd left my lens cap in the cabin. It was a small thing, barely worth $20, but it was for my best lens, and I didn't have a spare. I checked my watch. I still had about an hour of daylight left. If I moved fast, I could make it back to the cabin, grab the cap, and still get out before full dark. I turned around and hiked back up. The cabin looked different in the fading light. The shadows were longer, deeper, and the windows seemed to watch me as I approached. I told myself it was just the change in atmosphere, the way places feel different at dusk. I found the lens cap on the floor of the main room, right where I'd been standing earlier. I grabbed it and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Upstairs. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floor above me. I froze, listening. The footsteps continued, crossing the second floor, stopping then starting again. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small in the empty space. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding. Maybe it was a squatter, someone using the cabin for shelter, or an animal, a raccoon or possum that had gotten inside. But the footsteps had sounded heavy. Human. I should have left. Every instinct told me to walk out the door and not look back. But I'm curious by nature. It's part of why I'm good at my job. I needed to know. I moved to the base of the stairs and looked up. The second floor was dark, the hallway swallowed in shadow. "Is someone up there?" I called. No answer. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I started climbing the stairs, testing each step before putting my weight on it. When I reached the top, I swept the light down the hallway. Empty. I checked the first room. Nothing. The second room, the one with all the symbols, was also empty. But something felt different. The symbols seemed darker than before, like the burns had deepened. I moved to the third door, the one with the mural. It was open. I'd closed it when I left. I was sure I'd closed it. I pushed it wider and shone my light inside. The chair had moved. It was no longer in the center of the room. It was right in front of the door, facing me, like someone had been sitting there, waiting. And on the wall, the mural had changed. The figure was closer now, not by much, but enough to notice. It had moved forward in the scene, its long arms reaching toward the edges of the frame. I backed away, my breath coming faster. That wasn't possible. Paintings didn't change. I was just remembering it wrong, or the light was playing tricks, but I knew that wasn't true. I turned and ran. I made it down the stairs and out the front door, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't look back until I hit the tree line. When I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a light in the second floor window, faint, flickering, like a candle. And in the window, I could see a silhouette, tall and thin, watching me. I ran the entire 3 miles back to the trailhead. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I got home, I downloaded the photos from my camera. Most of them were fine. Good shots of the exterior, the decay, the atmosphere. But when I got to the photos of the mural, something was wrong. In the first photo, the one I took with the flash, the figure in the painting looked normal, centered, distant. But in each subsequent photo it moved. Frame by frame it came closer. The final photo, the last one I took before I left, showed the figure at the very edge of the painting, its arms extending off the canvas, reaching into the room. And in the background, barely visible in the shadows, there was something else. The chair wasn't empty. I deleted every photo from that cabin. I told Marcus I couldn't find the location, that the coordinates were wrong. He wasn't happy, but he didn't push it. Last week, I got an email from an unknown address. No subject line, no message, just an attachment. It was a photo. One I didn't take. It showed me standing in that upstairs room, looking at the mural. But the angle was wrong. It was taken from behind me, from the doorway. And in the reflection on my camera's LCD screen, I could see what was standing behind me. My brother-in-law Tom got us a hunting lease in the fall of 2018. It was a sweet deal. 200 acres of private land in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, right in prime deer territory. The property came with an old cabin that the landowner said we could use during hunting season. Tom, my buddy Mike, and I split the cost 3 ways. For what we were paying, it was a steal. We drove up the first weekend of November to check out the property and get the cabin ready. The land was beautiful. thick hardwood forest, a couple of ridges that overlooked valleys, and a creek running through the bottom. The cabin sat on a plateau about halfway up the mountain, accessible by a rough dirt road that wound through the trees. The cabin itself was rougher than the photo suggested. It was old, probably built in the 50s or 60s, with a tin roof and cedar siding that had gone dark with age. Inside, it was basic. One large room with a wood stove, a propane cooktop, and 4 bunk beds along the walls. There was an outhouse about 50 yards into the woods and a hand pump for water. "It ain't the Ritz," Tom said, "but it'll keep us dry." We spent that first day cleaning the place out, sweeping away spider webs and mouse droppings, and checking that the stove worked. By evening, we had a fire going, and were sitting outside on the porch with beers, watching the sun set over the ridge. That's when Tom mentioned the previous tenant. "Guy who had the lease before us," he said. "Apparently he left in a hurry, middle of the season last year. Just packed up and never came back." "Why?" Mike asked. Tom shrugged. "Landowner didn't say, just said the guy forfeited his deposit and told him to find someone else. I didn't think much of it at the time. People quit hunting leases for all kinds of reasons. Financial trouble, health issues, whatever. It didn't seem worth worrying about." We came back 2 weeks later for opening weekend. Mike couldn't make it. His wife had gone into labor early, so it was just Tom and me. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, unloaded our gear, and spent the evening scouting the property. We found fresh rubs and scrapes all over the place. The deer sign was incredible. That night, we turned in early. Hunting means getting up before dawn, and we wanted to be in our stands by first light. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of something moving outside. At first I thought it was a deer, but the sound was wrong. Too deliberate, too heavy. It sounded like footsteps on the gravel in front of the cabin. I lay there listening. Tom was snoring softly in the bunk across from me. The footsteps continued, slow, measured, circling the cabin. I sat up and looked toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint glow of moonlight around the edges. The footsteps stopped. The cabin went silent. Then I heard it. A low scraping sound, like something being dragged across the tin roof. I reached over and shook Tom awake. He sat up, groggy. "What? You hear that?" He listened. The scraping continued, moving from one end of the roof to the other. "Probably a branch," he whispered. "Wind must have picked up." But there was no wind. The trees outside were still. The scraping stopped. We waited in the dark, barely breathing. Then came 3 loud bangs on the roof, directly above us. Tom was on his feet in seconds, grabbing his flashlight. "What the hell?" He opened the door and stepped outside. I followed, my own flashlight in hand. We circled the cabin, shining our lights up at the roof. Nothing. No branches, no animals, no sign of what could have made that noise. "Maybe something fell," Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced. We checked the area around the cabin. No fallen limbs, no debris, nothing. We went back inside and sat up for a while, listening, but there were no more sounds. Eventually, we went back to bed. The next morning, we tried to shake it off. We grabbed our gear and headed out to our stands before sunrise. I'd set up on a ridge overlooking a creek bottom. Tom was about 400 yards away, watching a trail that ran along the edge of a clear cut. Hunting is mostly waiting. You sit in silence for hours, watching for movement. But that morning, something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Just a heavy, oppressive silence. Around 9, I heard a gunshot. It came from Tom's direction, a single crack that echoed through the valley. I waited, expecting to hear a second shot or see Tom emerge to start tracking, but there was nothing. After about 20 minutes, I climbed down and headed toward his stand. I found him sitting on the ground, his rifle across his lap, staring into the woods. "You get one?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked at me, his face was pale. "I shot at something," he said quietly. "A deer?" "I don't know." He stood up slowly. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, maybe 6 feet. I thought it was a hunter at first, but it wasn't wearing orange, just dark. And it wasn't moving right. "What do you mean?" "It was swaying, side to side, like it was, I don't know, like it was testing its balance. And then it turned toward me." "Did you see its face?" He shook his head. "That's the thing. I don't think it had one. Just a blank space where the face should have been. That's when I shot." "Did you hit it?" "I don't know, it didn't fall. It just stepped back into the trees and was gone." We searched the area for over an hour. No blood, no tracks, no sign that anything had been there. Tom didn't want to hunt the rest of the day. We went back to the cabin and spent the afternoon playing cards, trying to act normal, but I could tell he was rattled. That night, neither of us slept well. Every sound outside, the wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, made us tense up. Around midnight, I heard Tom get up. He went to the window and pulled back the curtain. "There's someone out there," he whispered. I got up and joined him. In the moonlight, I could see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. It was tall and thin, its arms hanging limply at its sides. "That's it," Tom said. "That's what I saw this morning." We watched it for several minutes. It didn't move. Just stood there, facing the cabin. Tom grabbed his rifle. "I'm going out there." "Don't. I need to know what it is." Before I could stop him, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the flashlight mounted underneath illuminating the clearing. The figure was gone. Tom swept the light across the tree line. Nothing. "Where'd it go?" he said, more to himself than to me. That's when he heard it. A voice coming from the woods. "Tom?" It was Tom's voice, his exact voice. He lowered the rifle slowly, his hands shaking. "That's not funny," he shouted. "Tom!" The voice came again, closer now. "Come here." I grabbed his shoulder. "Get inside. Now!" We backed into the cabin and locked the door. The voice continued, circling the cabin, calling Tom's name over and over. Sometimes it sounded like him. Other times, it sounded like me. And once, it sounded like Mike, even though Mike was 200 miles away. It went on for hours. We sat in the dark, listening, too afraid to move. By dawn, it had stopped. The woods were silent again. We packed up and left that morning. We didn't talk about what happened. We just loaded the truck and drove. When we got back, Tom called the landowner and told him we were giving up the lease. The guy didn't ask why. He just said, "Yeah, I figured." "What's that supposed to mean?" Tom asked. There was a long pause on the other end. "You boys are the 4th group to lease that property in 2 years. Nobody lasts more than a weekend. Why didn't you tell us that before? Would you have believed me?" Tom hung up. We never went back. I looked up the property a few months later, just out of curiosity. The listing was still active, but the price had dropped significantly. In the description, there was a new line at the bottom. "Remote location. Ideal for experienced outdoorsmen comfortable with isolation."